So today we're talking about value analysis. And with value analysis, there's, value can be a very encompassing term in the business world. So we're going to start by defining it. And then we're going to talk about value from the individual perspective. And then we're going to talk about exchanging value and how we do quantitative value analysis. And to kind of wrap it all together. So what is the definition of value? Value really is talking about benefits minus cost. And I know that's extremely broad, so we'll narrow that down as we go through the presentation. But this is the value equation, more or less. And as part of it, benefits are going to be the subjective part of the equation, and what kind of makes the equation make sense. But benefits is really anything. It can be very complex. It can be tangible, it can be intangible, it can be a combination. But for any particular value analysis, or if you're looking at a business or even a personal context, and we'll talk about that momentarily, the benefits are going to change from person to person. And it's really the aggregate benefit of a given process or a given situation that makes operating processes sustainable. If everyone valued, and I got to be careful using the word value in the definition of value, if everyone quantified a benefit the same way, then there'd be no opportunity to create value for the most part, because there'd be no relative difference in which you could do trading. And we'll talk about how that subjectivity plays in to the equation. And then on the other side of that, costs in the value equation is not subjective. This has to be an objective sort of comparative factor or comparing factor to make the analysis make any sense. Typically, this is currency. It's dollars and cents in the US. It could be any currency. It could be gold. It could be any sort of standard bartering mechanism. It doesn't really matter what it is, but cost has to remain objective between parties and between situations. Because if cost was also subjective, then the equation wouldn't really make any sense. So in terms of this value analysis definition or this value equation being valid, you have to think about the cost that you're measuring is going to have to be comparable and objective between instances of using the equation. And at the end of the day, the value is just the difference between the benefits achieved of a certain process and the cost spent to achieve them. So let's talk about the individual perspective of a value assessment. And I'm gonna, like, if I was in a training, I would normally give this more live and we'd all do it. But if you could just kind of do it yourselves and follow at your desk, I'm gonna walk through this exercise and I'm gonna discuss kind of how to think about the value equation from a personal perspective, assessing your own engagement with the process. So we're talking about here the use case of doing laundry in a big city, let's say like a New York or an LA or a Chicago or what have you. And if you've got 10 pounds of laundry a week, how do you wash it to get the most value? And there's two options here. You can do it in your apartment basement. And in that, it's this first line item. That would be you have 10 pounds of laundry and it costs about $8 to use the machines and detergent, and 1 hour of your time to do it downstairs. And that would be you loading and unloading, switching, walking up and down the elevators, whatever the situation is, and kind of putting in the manual labor to do the process. The other option here is doing 10 pounds of laundry by sending it out. So this costs $15, which is, you can see here, $1.20 a pound and $3 in delivery, and you don't spend any of your time. You just drop it on your way out of the building, they pick it up, wash it, dry it, fold it, return it, you pick it up on your way in. So with this being the scenario, you've got to write out the value equation. You can see down on the screen. So there's a downstairs version and there's a wash and fold version. And if you're calculating value using the value equation and you're doing value analysis, we're talking about benefits and cost. And this is where the first slide, you may have thought, okay, this is seeming pretty simple. This is where already in this example, this can get infinitely complicated. And we have to talk about benefits. There's a lot of different benefits. So first of all, what is the benefit of washing your clothes? And the first thing you might think is, well, it could be having clean clothes, but it's really the benefit of washing clothes is to not wear dirty clothes. So I'm giving that to you, that answer, just because there's a little bit of a way of thinking you have to push your mind into to do value analysis, especially if you're talking about benefits. And then how would you quantify what that benefit is worth in the same unit that we're using for cost, which in this case is dollars. And the way I challenge people to think about this is, if I asked you, how much would you pay? How much would I have to pay you to wear dirty clothes to work? That is your benefit, because the benefit of washing your clothes is not wearing dirty clothes to work. It could also be feeling clean. There's other benefits that you could assign. But if you're doing this on paper, when you're trying to calculate value, you need to ask yourself, what is that worth to you, that benefit? All the benefits that are associated in aggregate with having your clothes laundered. And I guarantee for the 20 or 30 of you on the training right now, you all might have different numbers written down. And this is speaking to that subjectivity that I was talking about on the first slide, about what is a benefit to different people and how do different people engage with value analysis in different contexts. Because I've had people in the past say, well, also, if I'm talking about downstairs versus sending it out, I assign a lot of value to being able to control the laundering process because I have very sensitive clothes. And if they're laundered incorrectly, it could cost me hundreds of dollars to replace them. Or there's certain services that lose clothes on a semi-regular basis. And the value of not having, my benefit of not having to worry about something happening outside of my control is also worth $50, $100, $200. So when you're calculating all the benefits here, you've got to think about, okay, what are all the things that I personally benefit from engaging in this process, and then how would I quantify them in the same unit of dollars and cents that I'm going to use to compare them in cost. So you would write that down in both these situations. And now if you go over to cost and filling out the cost side of the equation, there are hard costs here. Laundry machines take $8 worth of quarters and the money you pay for detergent. The service that is wash and fold, they're going to be $15, and those are hard numbers, so I put them in here. But then the one thing that you have to consider is always the cost of your time. And if anyone's who's done basic, economics work, the cost of time is something you have to put in here because it's the value of the opportunity cost, the quantification of your opportunity cost. So in the first situation, it costs an hour of your time, and the second, it costs none. So the question here again is, for your personal equation of analyzing value, what is the cost of your time? And a lot of people say I can use what I'm paid at work as a proxy for my hourly rate, but a lot of times your opportunity cost at home might be different than when you're at work. You could be somebody who values your personal time a lot more or a lot less than your working time, or just your colleague who's maybe in a similar circumstance. So this is where a very simple equation, even for you as an individual, analyzing value in a certain situation, it can get very complex. But if you start to practice doing it the same way every time and thinking about it in these terms, you can start to have a level of consistency in how you behave. So in the situation here, if my benefit was, I don't know, let's say $20 to have clean clothes to wear to work and feel comfortable, and the cost of my time was pretty high in terms of, let's say I'm worth $50 an hour, you can see some people are going to have negative value in using these services or doing it in a certain way, and some people are going to have positive value. And that's going to be pretty typical for value analysis. So the trick of value analysis is making sure you understand all the benefits, you understand all the costs, and then you're weighing them in a similar way in every situation, because it's going to be different, and sometimes wildly different for different people, even people that you would think would be similar. The things that people assign benefit to can be very wide-ranging. So that's how you would kind of engage with value analysis as an individual. So now let's talk about value analysis between two parties. And I'm going to just go with the classic customer and company, because that's your typical business interaction of exchanging value. And this is where what I was saying, because benefits are subjective, that's what allows the space or the differential between two parties to exchange goods and services and both receive value. And I'll discuss that in this diagram, how that works momentarily. Because the relative difference between different people, even if it's a person-to-person trading the same thing, or it's a company to a person, a lot of how you value your time, you value your benefits, is going to ultimately create the end result in your value analysis. So let's walk through some of this, how this works, the two value equations for a customer and a company interaction. I don't know if everyone can see my cursor. I'll just kind of talk through it. So for the customer, their value of buying, let's say, a really expensive t-shirt or an electronic, the benefit that they're going to put on that or quantify or value the benefit itself, let's say, is $100. So having this benefit is worth $100 to this person. Let's say it's clean clothes or what have you. And then the cost that the company is selling it for is 80. So this is pretty straightforward. If you have something that you benefit at more than the cost, then you are going to engage and you're going to buy that, and it's going to provide value. And you can see here in the middle, the customer gets $20 worth of value from engaging in that process. Now, if you're following the actual cost, which is the $80 to the customer, it flows as a revenue down to the benefit to the company. And this is where some folks, it's kind of illuminating to hear that the benefit for a company is always the opportunity for profit. The revenue itself is never the benefit for a company. Companies generally talk about revenue a lot, but they don't really care about revenue, even if they're not saying it. Because every time you make a sale, you could create negative profit if your process is bad and your cost eclipse the revenue coming in, in which case increasing revenue is actually a bad thing. So just pointing out the dynamics there, because every time you bring in revenue into the company, the benefit of the company is just having an opportunity for profit. And in some ways that can be a little confusing, but in other ways it's actually standard across every business customer interaction. So you can always be sure that when you're doing value analysis, it's how much opportunity for profit am I bringing in? That's the value of that $80 in this case that's flowing into the company. Now the cost to actually create the good or service, you can see that cost is $60 here. And in this case, it is profitable. And they're also making $20 of value. So in this case, the company and the customer, when they exchange value here, they're exchanging relatively similar. They're exchanging and it works out well because they're both making similar value, even though all the numbers for each party are different. And this is where, again, if the cost was higher on the company, they would make less value and they may be less inclined to trade. When these kind of interactions and value analysis reach an equilibrium, both parties are going to usually land around the same value. Otherwise, they could find probably better trade partners elsewhere that are going to produce more value for both parties, and it would be, that it's creating more mutual benefit essentially. So this is what, at a very generic level, these kind of interactions look like. And let's take another example where we actually play this out. So in this one, I'm doing a lemonade stand example. And we're just I'll just lay out the scene. So Bob is buying lemonade from Gary for $2. Glass of lemonade is worth 30 cents of materials. So the question is, why would anyone buy it for $2? It's kind of the same in our last slide where somebody's buying something for $80, even though it's only costing $60 to produce. And, in some ways you could say, well, why would anyone do that? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, and a lot of it has to do with the subjectivity and the difference in the benefits. And in this case, for lemonade, there could be a million benefits, like in every process, but I'm just going to isolate labor cost differences just to make the math a little bit simpler. So if it takes 5 minutes to make glass lemonade for Bob, and he's a lawyer, so he's charging at $500 an hour, and Gary's a child, and he's only worth maybe $1 an hour, then the opportunity cost involved in making that glass of lemonade itself, just the time involved, is about $42, assuming it takes 5 minutes for Bob's time, only 8 cents for Gary's time. So already you can see here, if you're just considering, well, why would Bob buy a glass of lemonade when it's so much over its cost? If you're just looking at the opportunity cost and labor, that's one factor that could drive that decision. And obviously, if you look at the math from that perspective, you can see here that Bob is getting a lot more value if you're just thinking about labor than Gary is getting, because he gets the benefit of saving that $42 worth of labor. Whereas Gary, all it's costing him is 8 cents of his labor time. And it only costs him 30 cents. So if you follow the math and you can follow the value equation here, it's painting a very stilted picture because I'm only focusing on labor. Bob, the lawyer, he may also be supporting his sister's kids. He may just be somebody who gets a lot of intangible benefit from being philanthropic and engaging in child-run businesses. I mean, there's a million different things that could go into this, as well as the costs. And that's why value analysis, you just have to be, like I said, consistent in the way you think about these things. Because if I only looked at labor, the point on the bottom is he could raise the prices, Gary could, to $42.30. As long as it's below that, Bob is still going to get value. And if he only cared about saving his time and he wanted lemonade, then he could there'd still be space to exchange there, because there's so much relative difference between Bob and Gary's assignment of benefit and cost around labor time that it creates the space again for this value exchange to exist. So this is the main kind of way that we think about value analysis. It's really just running through as comprehensively as one can the value equation and trying to get into the customer persona, the perspective, looking at the interactions and looking at where that space is and are we actually providing value in the right way. So those are two examples and the little numbers for you to bite onto. But I'd also like to give a less math-driven definition, and this is more from the lean school of thought, which is that you can analyze what is value adding and what's not by just kind of having some of these flyby rules. And the first one is this something that a customer would be willing to pay for directly? So there's a lot of activity that goes on in companies that if the customer knew it was happening, then they wouldn't want to pay for it. Just as an extreme example, like the holiday party for a company. Would the customer want to pay for the holiday party? Would the customer want to pay for prepping for the holiday party by the marketing team during work hours? Probably not. So is that value adding to the actual product? The answer would be no. That doesn't mean that it doesn't add value to the company or the company's ability to be productive and produce an efficient and scalable and sustainable culture, but those are different arguments. You're always kind of looking from the business perspective, if something is adding value, is it adding value to the customer? Because that's the kind of value that you want to make sure you're monitoring to sustain the company over time. So the second rule here is, does this activity change the form, fit, or function of the product or service? And that means, it's another, like I said, by the thumb kind of rule of, if I did something, if I have a product or service I'm creating for a customer, I run it through a process and it's not materially changed, then it's probably not a value adding step. Generally, any activity that consumes energy and doesn't add value is considered waste. That's the formal definition of waste from the lean perspective. It's just activity without value creation. And activity that doesn't create value is activity that adds cost to your process. The bottom thing, just for you to take away, is a fun fact. This is from Six Sigma studies that have been pretty exhaustive and have validated over the years in many companies. And typically, companies are spending less than 5% of their working time on value-adding activities. And you may seem, well, that's completely ridiculous at first glance, but it's actually quite true. And a lot of activity is, when you do a lot of lean analysis, you realize that there's plenty of activity that can be value adding, business required, or I'm sorry, non-value adding, but business required. And that actually takes up the most of a lot of companies, especially bigger companies, even like regulatory and compliance, for instance. That could be a whole department of people working full time, and that doesn't actually have a meaningful change on the product or service, or the customer is usually not willing to pay for that. And it's considered waste from a lean perspective, but it doesn't mean we can do away with it. So don't be quick to dismiss the idea that 95% of activity is wasteful in business, because a lot of times that's actually the case. So that's just a quick summary of value adding versus non-value adding in the work environment. And then I have a few examples here. Just go ahead and read them. We're running a little short on time today. So you can just kind of read these along with me and kind of ask any questions if you have any, because some of these are meant to stimulate thinking. But some of these are just typical examples of value adding processes at work. And then some of them are just non-value adding. And things like creating checklists to improve customer service. You might say, well, that seems like a positive thing. But for example, it's not changing anything in the company. And also customers don't care. They don't want to pay for you to build your own checklist to make the product better. They just want to pay for the product. So it's ways like this where you have to kind of change the way you think. And it all comes back down to the idea that anyone's only trading in benefits and costs. So a lot of this can get very confusing, but if you kind of stick with the value equation and always come back to this, it should be a good guiding, a North Star for value analysis. Because in life and business, you're always trying to produce net positive value, because anything else is really unsustainable. And what I mean sustainable, if you're not creating positive value because your benefits are not greater than your costs, then that process is going to go away over time. That business is going to go away over time. Your energy is going to shy away from personal processes over time. If every time you do it, it costs you more energy, time, money, whatever it is, than the benefit you get. Any process, though, on the alternative that creates positive value can be sustainable and continue indefinitely. It doesn't matter what it is. If every time the process runs, it's creating more benefit for the people participating than it costs, then that's a process that can go on forever. And that's what you're trying to cultivate when you're analyzing the value production in a process. So that's pretty much it, at least the thought I wanted to share with you today. So just to summarize quickly, it's the value is the difference between subjectively comparable benefits and objectively comparable costs. It can be used, the value equation we went over, to really qualify anything. Individual interactions, group interactions. I use it in consulting for startups, small companies, all the way through multinational enterprises. And one thing to remember, opportunity for profit is the only benefit for a business. There is no other benefit for a business from the business's perspective. Now, you could say there's some intangibles like philanthropy, charitable contributions, things like that. But generally, there can be a series of convoluted conversations we can have where that all kind of folds into the general value proposition of a company, which is to bring in revenue to sustain itself and have an opportunity to be profitable. Because outside of that, then there will be no sustained survival for business. Value can be qualified as something customers are willing to pay for or materially change the product or service, and it must be positive to be sustainable. Those are my closing notes.
Sam, we thank you so much for your time and for presenting with us today.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.